Let me start out by thanking Alex for his help, for his advice, comments, friendship over the years, both on my behalf and behalf of colleagues in the monetary department, especially Mayor Suckler, and can't be here today for very little in my discussion isn't already in Athanasios's paper and also in Benny Ben's discussion, but I'll be the issues in my own way. I'm very sympathetic to the basic approach in Carl's paper. I think transparency about reading of the economy is at least as important as transparency about central bank objectives or controllability, given that the public has a general sense of the preferences of the central bank. Central banks generally get more criticism, or at least as much criticism, about the so-called errors of assessment of the economy than disagreement about objectives. I'd like to talk about two issues in my discussion, more specific ones. One is what is the minimal definition of inflation targeting and what are the implications for central bank communication? And the other is why not publish the central bank's noisy signal on demand and supply shocks instead of presumably the noisier signals and short-run targets or instruments, in the sense that I'll assume, unlike Carl, that the public doesn't know exactly what the central bank objective function is. Okay? Concerning the issues of minimal definition of inflation targeting, in the beginning of his paper, Carl says at a minimum, inflation targeting involves the formal announcement of a target for inflation. I disagree a bit with that. Inflation targeting does, of course, involve the formal announcement of an inflation target, but also some credible commitment, possibly implicit, to an action plan, not necessarily a reaction function, but some action plan to react to deviations, possibly incipient from the target. So the implications of that for central bank transparency is that in its communication to the public, the central bank must be very careful not to contradict either of the basic minimalist conditions for inflation targeting, neither the announced target nor the reaction process. Logical contradictions in communication impede credibility. For example, consider inflation forecasts based on assumed constant policy rates. That violates the inflation targeting regime. Why? Because it overrides the reaction function. Why should the public believe a central bank that publishes a forecast that overrides its reaction process? Now, the recent literature has been very critical of the constant interest rate rules, but I don't think it's hit the nail exactly on the head. Okay? A second issue is in terms of the target itself. There's potential for confusion between the lengths of the run. What's the short term and what's the long term, in the sense that the lengths of the run may depend on credibility. They may be endogenous, not necessarily exogenous. The concepts of forecast and a target. Target is something you think you can hit. So if you're telling the public you think you can hit it, they would expect you to hit it. Okay? A generalization of this is that the details of central bank communication, and especially the publication of forecasts or short-term targets, must be regime-oriented. I have a paper coming out with a colleague, R.A. Falk, and myself on this issue. Relating it to the present paper, the publication of the central bank's information about the shocks is regime-neutral. In no way can this information contradict any given regime because it's not about the regime. This would seem to be an important advantage of publishing the shocks rather than variables that involve additional parameters such as short-term targets that involve the central bank's loss function. Okay? So in the context of the present, let me skip this. So that's the main advantage of publishing the shocks. What are the disadvantages? Alex, in discussion earlier, told me about literature on this that relates publishing the shocks to expectational issues. Let's assume that those can be dealt with by other types of announcements. I think the main problem with publishing the shocks is that nobody really knows the shocks in one way or another. First of all, there's a lack of identification. The central bank itself may not have enough confidence in its specification of the structure, and the public may be all the more skeptical. For example, think of the Hurricane Katrina. People I talked to at the Bank of Israel and one or two other central banks thought that this was mainly a supply shock and that interest rates should go up. But in the few days, a week or so after Katrina, interest rates went down. So maybe people thought it was mainly, the public thought maybe it might have been a demand shock. Okay. There are high noise levels that vitiate the information from announced shocks and may generate Morrishian effects, especially in particularly noisy economies. Like Morrishian effects may be more important in noisier economies. The evidence presented in Athanasios' paper supports this, but I'll give you some evidence for Israel. These are inflation fan charts based on the model in use in the monetary department that was done by David Al-Khayyam. It's a small neo-Excelian model, meaning that we collapse the IS curve, the IS equation, the Phillips curve into one equation, get rid of the output gap, and the real sector is represented by the real interest rate. There's a monetary policy reaction function, exchange rate equation, and here's what you get when the Fed chart is generated only by shocks to the inflation equation itself. The variance of the shocks are from the standard error of the regression. The range of inflation after 2 years out is from -2 to +6. That's 8 percentage points. That's 4 times the size of the width of the inflation target. Yeah, with a policy response. With the policy response. Okay? But generated only by the inflation equation shocks. Here we added one further shock from foreign currency import prices, and the range increases from -3 to +7, 10 percentage points, or 5 times the width of the inflation of the target band. These are interest rate fan charts for the same 2 exercises. For the case for inflation shocks, inflation equation shocks only, it's 4 to 7%, 3 percentage points. Fairly noisy, I would think, for the interest rate. And with import prices, it's -3.5 to 7.5, or 4 percentage points. So this gives an indication in the Israeli context of the degree of uncertainty about the shocks. A couple of technical issues in the paper. It seems to me there's no reason why private sector noise has to average to 0. Firms' assessments of cost shocks could be biased in one direction at an instant in time, so that this is sort of an assumption for convenience. And regarding the partial release of information, I asked whether this is common knowledge. Does everybody know that only part of the people are getting some of the information, but that some people have better information than they might have if they didn't get it? It's not clear what's assumed, and the question, of course, is who should get the information. The general lessons from this discussion, to sum up, is that publishing the shocks is not reasonable. The only alternative is, in fact, the indirect indicators, such as short-term forecasts, and we have to take the chance that these may well be misinterpreted. It's too much uncertainty, too much lack of identification. Or to put it a little bit more colorfully at 4:45 in the evening, I say ick causes muck, or incomplete common knowledge causes more unconvinced common knaves. It's hard to convince people when there's too much noise. So the lessons for central bank transparency of all of this is avoid at all time communication that involves logical inconsistencies. You need more sensitivity to this issue, and give the public some sense of what the central bank thinks it knows and what it thinks it doesn't know. The central bank should give the public a reasonable sense of the direction and order of magnitudes of incipient pressures on inflation and output, just enough to justify movements of the key rate. But let's not oversell the ability to forecast or to identify the structure. Final word in the recent Nobel Prize winner, Robert Aumann, often criticizes experimental economics on the grounds that the experiments are too artificial. People don't behave in these artificial environments the same way that they would behave in the real world. In the same sense, the models that we have create an artificial environment that may give the wrong sense of certainty about some aspects of the world and uncertainty about other aspects of the world. Maybe there's some way we can increase the fuzziness about the environment in general and make the models a little bit more realistic.